Chapter 14, Video 1. If you wonder sometimes why I'm kind of doing an owl thing, I do have my notes over here to make sure I'm staying on track because I don't want these videos to run too long, each one individually. I know you're getting sick of them, but we're somewhat in the home stretch. This chapter is looking at the 1840s, and the last president that we had talked about was William Henry Harrison. We had talked about him being elected in the election of 1840 with his vice president, John Tyler. We had talked about the campaign slogan of Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and we had mentioned that William Henry Harrison is going to be the first president to die in office. He had made it a month. He had actually become ill, seems to be as a result of giving an inaugural address for a very long period of time in the freezing rain in Washington, D.C. There's been a recent story in the news, though, that maybe he had become ill from the raw sewage that was all around the White House at the time. At any rate, he's the first president to die in office, and John Tyler then steps forward to take the reins of the presidency. And while the Constitution had always called for that, it didn't really clarify if John Tyler would become an acting president, an interim president, or, just kind of keep the seat warm until the next guy. But John Tyler is going to fully and completely take over the duties, responsibilities, rights, privileges, and so forth of the presidency. And he sets that precedent for doing so. However, neither political party will like John Tyler. Even his own political party doesn't like John Tyler. And so he is going to get the nickname His Accidency by the time that one and only term that he will serve is up. We're going to have some issues with Great Britain in this time period, in the 1840s. They were patrolling, they had begun to patrol off the coast of Africa to make sure that we weren't smuggling slaves out of Africa. And that was offensive to us because, of course, it's the idea that we are not managing our own laws properly. And so that's going to cause tension between us and the British. There also was a ship called the Creole that was carrying slaves from Virginia down the East Coast, at which point it was supposed to go around Florida and over to New Orleans. But the crew mutinied and took over, well, the passengers, I suppose, mutinied and took over, and instead of going around Florida to New Orleans, they continued on south to the Bahamas, where the British controlled that area. The British are going to set the slaves free. And even though the American government is not, in the North, was not supporting slavery in the northern states, part of the country did have slavery, and this, at the time, these slaves still were considered property, and that was American property that was not being returned by the British government. So that contributed to tensions as well. But what we're going to do to try to ease some tensions and the possibility of ending up in a war is there will be the passage of the Ashburton-Webster Treaty or the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. And this is going to decide the border between the United States and British Canada from Lake of the Woods over to the east. Now, we had talked before about the Convention of 1818 that decided the border from Lake of the Woods over to the Oregon Territory. This is bringing it back from that starting point at Lake of the Woods over to the east. This also is a time period where there's a little bit of manifest destiny. We have two time periods of manifest destiny in our history. One is the 1840s and one is in the 1890s. And the idea behind manifest destiny is that God wants us to expand. It's the idea that we're doing things better with our capitalism, with our Judeo-Christian background and so forth, that we have something better going on than other places, and therefore we need to spread out to other areas. And the term manifest destiny comes from a magazine editorial. But it gives sort of a moral justification for us expanding our territory. Now, when we're looking at expanding territory, we're talking, in the 1840s, we're talking about going further into the West. In the 1840 census, there seems to be about 325,000 Indians in that Western territory. They have different, they're settled in different groups and they're engaged in different activities. The plains You see Indians who were chasing buffalo and fighting different groups. And you have folks like the Sioux Indians and the Cheyenne Indians. When you come to the Southern Plains, you see more of the warrior Indians like the Apache and the Comanche. In the Southwest, you see Indians living peacefully and farming and having villages and so forth, and this might include the Pueblo. In the Rocky Mountains, you have some of the Digger Indians like the Utes and the Paiutes. In the Northwest, you see peaceful Indians like the Nez Perce, so forth. So you see a variety of groups out in the West who are getting along in a variety of ways. We had started to move into that area with the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition. And ever since Lewis and Clark had returned, there were fur trappers and traders, men who were called mountain men, who were going to go off into the West, into the mountains and so forth, and trap animals and trade the skins and so forth. We see with that a greater shift of Americans into Oregon. And by 1845, there were about 5,000 American settlers in Oregon. And remember, we're still sharing this territory with the British. We also were moving further into the Southwest as we're trading more with Mexico and easing over into California. And John Sutter is going to open a fort in California near Sacramento, which will offer all sorts of items to travelers who are migrating west. Gold being discovered in California in 1848 is going to be a huge draw for people to move out west, and we see people flooding into the area in 1849. That's where California gets the 49ers. John C. Fremont, whose nickname was the Pathfinder, is going to support this. He's going to write a number of different materials to tell people how to successfully make it out to California, what supplies to get, what routes to take, and so forth, and was very interested in settling all the way out to California. The first thing that people think about when they think about traveling out west, though, is Indian attacks. But really fewer than 4% of the deaths that happened on these trails happened as a result of Indian attacks. And part of that was the high number of deaths due to dysentery and other issues. The other part, we had signed something called the Fort Laramie Treaty with a large number of Indians, where we made deals with the Indians where we would pay them a certain amount of money so that these migrants, these folks, Americans, could go and move across those territories in the West. The Indians also agreed to allow some forts in the area. And the money also kind of went to offset some of the problems that were created by our traveling out west, where we were decimating the buffalo and making ruts in the ground and so forth.